The flight that changed everything. It was a warm, breezy afternoon in Atlanta when Chris and Tanya arrived at the bustling Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The couple was buzzing with excitement, ready to embark on a long-awaited vacation to New York City. They had planned this trip for months, a break from the monotony of work and the stress of everyday life. Little did they know, their flight would turn into an experience they'd never forget, sparking a chain of events that would leave a mark not only on them, but on an entire airline. The terminal was alive with the usual chaos of travelers dragging suitcases, flight announcements echoing overhead, and the occasional child's laughter breaking through the din. Chris and Tanya, both in their late 20s, made their way to their gate, their fingers interlocked. Chris, a software engineer with a calm and measured demeanor, carried their tickets while Tanya, a lively elementary school teacher with a contagious smile, chattered about their itinerary. As they reached the gate, the announcement for boarding rang out. Tanya nudged Chris. "Let's get on early so we can settle in," she said. They were flying economy class, and Tanya always worried about overhead storage filling up too quickly. Chris nodded, and they joined the line of passengers. Once on the plane, they found their seats near the middle of the cabin, a window and aisle seat combo. Tanya stored her backpack in the overhead bin, but there wasn't enough space for their second bag. She turned toward the aisle, spotting a flight attendant approaching. The woman wore the airline's crisp uniform, her badge identifying her as Karen. "Excuse me," Tanya said with a polite smile. "Is there any space in another overhead bin? I'm having trouble fitting this bag here." Karen's expression was cold, her lips pursed as if she'd just bitten into a lemon. Without a word, she pointed to a compartment several rows away. Her abruptness took Tanya aback, but she decided to let it slide. "Thank you," Tanya said as she maneuvered the bag down the aisle. When Tanya returned to her seat, Chris raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" She shrugged. "Yeah, just a little. Kurt, maybe she's having a bad day." Chris nodded, his attention already returning to his book. Tanya settled into her seat, hoping to leave the interaction behind. But Karen wasn't done making her presence felt. As the plane filled, Karen walked briskly down the aisle, her expression stern. When her gaze landed on Tanya and Chris, Tanya tried to break the tension with a friendly smile. To her surprise, Karen stopped abruptly and said loudly, "You should have figured out your luggage before boarding." The words hit Tanya like a slap. They weren't just sharp, they were humiliating. Several passengers turned to look, their faces a mixture of shock and curiosity. Chris, who had been flipping a page in his book, froze mid-motion. Tanya's voice trembled slightly as she replied, "Excuse me, is there a problem?" Karen folded her arms and tilted her head. "I'm just saying, it's not that hard to plan ahead." Chris stood up then, his tall frame towering over the petite flight attendant. His tone was calm but firm. "That was unnecessary. There's no reason to speak to us that way." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, are we sensitive now?" Gasps rippled through the nearby passengers. Tanya felt her face flush, a mixture of embarrassment and anger bubbling up inside her. She opened her mouth to respond, but Karen turned on her heel and marched off toward the front of the plane, leaving them in stunned silence. Chris sat back down, his jaw tight. "Did that just happen?" he muttered under his breath. Tanya nodded, her hands clenched in her lap. "I can't believe it," she said softly. "Why would she treat us like that?" The couple tried to make sense of the situation, but before they could dwell on it further, another flight attendant appeared. This one was a man in his 40s with a calm demeanor and a name tag that read Greg. He stopped at their row and crouched slightly, speaking in a low voice. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, "but I couldn't help noticing the interaction earlier. Is everything okay?" Chris and Tanya exchanged a look. Tanya hesitated, but Chris spoke up. "She was rude, completely unprofessional," he said. "She humiliated us in front of everyone." Greg nodded, his expression serious. "Thank you for letting me know." I'll handle it." He straightened up and walked toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain to the galley. Tanya and Chris sat in silence, their emotions swirling: anger, embarrassment, and now a flicker of hope that someone might take their side. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Tanya's stomach churned as she glanced at the rows of passengers who had witnessed the incident. Some were whispering, others avoided eye contact, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. Finally, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that there will be a change in cabin crew for the remainder of this flight. We appreciate your patience as we address the situation." Tanya's heart raced. A murmur spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks, but Tanya and Chris knew exactly what this announcement meant. 5 minutes later, the curtain to the galley parted, and Karen emerged, flanked by Greg and another crew member. Her face was flushed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She avoided looking at Tanya and Chris as she was escorted down the aisle. The silence was deafening as every passenger watched her leave. As Karen disappeared through the exit, Tanya felt a strange mix of emotions: vindication, relief, and lingering disbelief. She turned to Chris, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did that really just happen?" Chris gave a small smile. "It did, and it's about time." But neither of them could have predicted that this was only the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond the confines of that airplane. A spark that ignited a movement. The plane was silent after Karen's abrupt exit. Passengers exchanged whispers, and Tanya felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes on her and Chris. She didn't meet their gaze, instead turning to Chris, who sat with his arms crossed, his expression a mix of tension and disbelief. "That just happened," Tanya said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It did," Chris replied, his tone calm but firm. "And it needed to." Tanya nodded, still processing what had occurred. Her hands fidgeted with the sleeve of her jacket, a nervous habit she hadn't realized she'd picked up. She wasn't used to confrontation, especially not public ones, and the spotlight wasn't where she wanted to be. Yet here she was. Minutes later, Greg returned to their row, his demeanor still composed but more deliberate now. He crouched beside them, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing more attention. "First, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened," Greg began. "Her behavior was unacceptable and doesn't reflect our standards. We've taken immediate action to ensure the rest of your flight is as comfortable as possible." Tanya looked at Chris, then back at Greg. "Thank you," she said hesitantly. "But why did it even get to this point? She didn't just treat us badly. She humiliated us. What happens now?" Greg nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your frustration, and you're absolutely right. This should never have happened. I can't speak to her state of mind or history, but I can tell you that incidents like this are taken very seriously. The airline will be conducting a full investigation into her conduct." Chris leaned forward, his tone measured but direct. "She's not the only problem, though, is she? If someone like that can stay in this job long enough to act that way in front of a plane full of people, there's something bigger at play." Greg hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "We're working on improving our training and standards. What happened today is a sign that we have a long way to go." As Greg walked away, Tanya and Chris exchanged a look. "Do you think they really mean it?" Tanya asked. Chris shrugged. "Hard to say. Talk is cheap. But what just happened wasn't. They didn't just brush this under the rug. That's something." The rest of the flight passed in relative quiet. The new crew members, clearly aware of the tension, were overly attentive, checking in on Tanya and Chris regularly. While the gestures were appreciated, they couldn't erase what had already transpired. Tanya found herself replaying Karen's words in her mind, the sting of humiliation mingling with a nagging curiosity. Why had Karen reacted that way? Was this about them personally, or was it something deeper? When the plane finally landed in New York, Tanya and Chris disembarked along with the other passengers. As they made their way through the terminal, a woman approached them. She was in her late 40s, with kind eyes and a professional air. Her badge identified her as Julia, an airline representative. "Mr. and Mrs. Davis?" Julia asked. Tanya and Chris nodded. "I'm Julia, part of the airline's customer relations team. I'd like to take a few minutes to speak with you about what happened today, if you're willing." Chris glanced at Tanya, who gave a small nod. "Sure," he said. Julia led them to a small office near the gate, where she invited them to sit. She offered water, which they politely declined, before settling into the chair across from them. "First, let me start by saying how sorry we are for what happened on your flight," Julia began. "We've already spoken with the crew, and Karen has been placed on immediate leave pending a full investigation." Tanya raised an eyebrow. "Immediate leave? Does that mean she could come back?" Julia hesitated. "I can't speak to the outcome of the investigation, but I can assure you that her actions today were a serious violation of our policies. She'll be held accountable." Chris frowned. "With all due respect, how does someone like that even stay in a role like this long enough to do something like this? We're not the first people she's treated this way, are we?" Julia's expression softened. "I don't know the specifics of her history, but I can tell you that we're looking into it. This incident has highlighted areas where we need to improve, not just in addressing individual behavior, but in creating an environment where something like this doesn't happen in the first place." Tanya shifted in her seat. "So what happens now? You've apologized, and that's appreciated, but is anything really going to change?" Julia's tone grew more serious. "Yes, I can't promise overnight solutions, but this incident has already sparked conversations at the highest levels of the company. We're reviewing our training programs, our hiring practices, and even our complaint systems to ensure that every passenger feels valued and respected." Chris leaned forward. "I hope that's true. We don't want an apology that just checks a box. We want to know that something meaningful will come from this." Julia nodded. "I understand. And I want you to know that your voices matter. What you experienced today is unacceptable, and it's driving us to take action." As they left the office, Tanya felt a mix of emotions: relief that they'd been heard, skepticism about whether things would really change, and a lingering frustration that it had taken such a public confrontation for the airline to act. Chris put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We did what we could," he said. "Now it's up to them." Over the next few days, Tanya and Chris tried to focus on their vacation, but the incident lingered in the back of their minds. They couldn't shake the feeling that their experience was just the tip of the iceberg, that Karen's behavior was a symptom of a larger issue. On the third day of their trip, Tanya's phone buzzed with an email notification. She opened it to find a message from the airline. It was long and detailed, outlining steps the company was taking to address the situation. It mentioned additional training for crew members, a review of their complaint handling procedures, and a promise to follow up with Tanya and Chris directly once the investigation was complete. "They're really doing something," Tanya said, showing Chris the email. He skimmed it, nodding slowly. "It's a start," he said. "Let's see if they follow through." What Tanya and Chris didn't realize was that their experience was already beginning to ripple outward. Back at the airline's headquarters, senior executives were holding emergency meetings, grappling with how to handle the growing scrutiny over customer service issues. Karen's actions had been the catalyst, but the broader conversation was only just beginning. And for Tanya and Chris, their story was far from over. The ripple effect. 2 weeks after their unsettling flight, Tanya and Chris were back in Atlanta, settling into their normal routine. Yet the events of that day still lingered in their minds like a shadow that refused to fade. The flight wasn't just a bad experience. It felt like a moment that revealed something bigger, something more insidious about the world around them. It was late afternoon, and Tanya sat at their small dining table, scrolling through her phone while Chris prepared dinner in the kitchen. She'd received an email from the airline earlier that day, but she hadn't opened it yet. Part of her didn't want to. She wasn't sure she could deal with another vague apology or empty promises. "You gonna read that email?" Chris called from the kitchen, glancing over his shoulder. Tanya sighed. "I don't know. What if it's just the same corporate nonsense? We value your feedback. We're committed to improvement. You know, the usual." Chris turned off the stove and walked over, wiping his hands on a dish towel. It might be. But what if it's not? What if they're actually doing something? Tanya raised an eyebrow. "You're more optimistic than me." Chris chuckled. "Someone has to be." Reluctantly, Tanya opened the email. Her eyes scanned the words, and her skeptical expression slowly softened into one of surprise. "Dear Ms. Davis," the email began. "We want to update you on the actions we've taken since your flight. As part of our investigation, we have confirmed that the behavior of the flight attendant in question was a clear violation of our company's standards. She has been permanently removed from our staff." Tanya paused, glancing at Chris. "They fired her," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. Chris leaned in, reading over her shoulder. "Well, that's a start." But the email didn't stop there. To address the broader concerns raised by this incident, we have launched a company-wide initiative to improve customer service standards and cultural sensitivity training. This includes a mandatory program for all staff, focusing on inclusivity, empathy, and conflict resolution. We believe this is a necessary step toward ensuring that all our passengers feel respected and valued. Tanya leaned back in her chair, letting the words sink in. "They're overhauling their training." "It's more than I expected." Chris nodded. "That's actually impressive. But do you think it'll stick?" "I don't know," Tanya admitted. "But at least it's a start." What they didn't know was that their experience had sparked a firestorm within the airline. Karen's actions, combined with the couple's calm but firm response, had forced the company to confront deeper issues in its training and culture. The incident had made its way up the corporate ladder, reaching senior executives who realized that sweeping it under the rug wasn't an option. A week after the email, Tanya and Chris were surprised to receive a call from a local news outlet. The reporter explained that they'd heard about the incident through passengers on the flight and wanted to run a story on it. "We want to highlight how you stood up for yourselves and how the airline responded," the reporter said. "Would you be open to an interview?" Tanya hesitated. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the idea of their story being public felt overwhelming. But Chris saw the potential. "This could be bigger than us," he said after the call. "If sharing our story encourages other people to speak up, it's worth it." Tanya nodded, though the idea still made her uneasy. "Okay, let's do it." The interview took place in a small studio downtown. The reporter, a young woman named Amelia, had an empathetic demeanor that put Tanya at ease. She started with the basics: what had happened on the flight, how it made them feel, and what they thought of the airline's response. "I think the airline is trying," Tanya said cautiously. "They've made changes, and that's good. But one incident isn't going to fix everything. There's still work to be done." Chris chimed in. "It's not just about this one flight. It's about creating a culture where people feel respected, no matter who they are or where they're from. That's what needs to change." The interview aired a week later, and the response was immediate. Tanya's phone buzzed with messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had seen the story. Some shared similar experiences of feeling mistreated or overlooked, while others applauded the couple for speaking up. As the story gained traction, it caught the attention of advocacy groups focused on racial equity and workplace accountability. One group, the National Alliance for Fair Treatment, NAFT, reached out to Tanya and Chris, inviting them to speak at an upcoming conference on customer service and implicit bias. "I'm not a public speaker," Tanya said nervously when they got the invitation. "You don't have to be," Chris replied. "Just tell your story. That's all they're asking." Reluctantly, Tanya agreed. The conference was held in a sleek, modern venue downtown. The audience was a mix of industry professionals, activists, and everyday people interested in the topic. When Tanya and Chris took the stage, her nerves threatened to get the best of her. But as she looked out at the crowd, she realized something important. Their story wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt disrespected, dismissed, or devalued. By the time Tanya finished speaking, the room was silent. Then, as her words sank in, the audience erupted into applause. She looked at Chris, who gave her a reassuring nod. For the first time since the flight, she felt a sense of closure, not because everything was fixed, but because she knew they had done their part. The ripple effects of their story continued. The airline rolled out its new training program, and other companies in the industry took note, initiating their own reviews and updates. Tanya and Chris's experience had sparked a conversation that extended far beyond a single flight, proving that even small moments of courage could lead to meaningful change. Beyond the cabin doors, months after the fateful flight, life for Tanya and Chris began to settle into a semblance of normalcy. Their story had been featured in news outlets, discussed in online forums, and even sparked debates on social media. It seemed like everyone had an opinion about what happened, whether Karen's dismissal was justified, whether the airline's response was genuine, and what the incident said about the state of customer service and bias in modern industries. Tanya, however, still found herself haunted by the memory of that day. Not just because of the humiliation she'd felt, but because of the questions that lingered. Had Karen's actions been fueled by personal bias? Was this an isolated incident, or a symptom of something much larger? And more importantly, would the airline's promises lead to lasting change, or would it all be forgotten as soon as the headlines faded? One chilly morning, Tanya sat on the balcony of their apartment, sipping her coffee as the city buzzed below. She scrolled through her emails, deleting spam and newsletters she didn't remember subscribing to, when a subject line caught her eye. Follow-up: Airlines Cultural Sensitivity Training and Customer Feedback Initiative. She hesitated before clicking, unsure if she had the emotional energy to dive back into the topic. But curiosity won out. The email was from Robert, the same airline representative who had reached out to her shortly after the incident. "Dear Ms. Davis," it began, "I wanted to personally update you on the progress of our company-wide initiatives sparked by the incident on your flight. As of this month, we have rolled out a comprehensive cultural sensitivity and inclusivity training program for all staff, from flight attendants to senior management. In addition, we've implemented a new real-time feedback system for passengers, allowing them to report issues directly to our leadership team." Tanya's eyebrows rose. This wasn't the usual corporate fluff. The email went on to detail the steps they'd taken, including partnerships with advocacy groups and industry consultants, to ensure the changes were meaningful and effective. Chris joined her on the balcony, holding his own mug of coffee. "You look deep in thought," he said, pulling up a chair. Tanya handed him her phone. "Read this." Chris scanned the email, nodding as he read. "This sounds promising," he said cautiously. "But do you think it's real, or is this just them trying to save face?" Tanya shrugged. "Hard to say. But it feels different, doesn't it? Like they're actually trying." Chris set the phone down and took a sip of coffee. "It's a good start, but the real test is if they keep it up." A few weeks later, Tanya and Chris received another surprising invitation, this time from the airline itself. The company was hosting a roundtable discussion with industry leaders, advocacy groups, and a few select passengers to discuss the future of customer service and inclusion in aviation. The email made it clear that Tanya and Chris's presence was not just requested but valued. "I don't know, Chris," Tanya said as she read the invitation aloud. "Do we really want to get involved with this again? It's not like we're experts." Chris smiled. "We might not be experts, but we're part of the reason they're doing this. If they're serious about change, maybe we should help them get it right." The roundtable was held in a sleek conference room at the airline's headquarters, a sprawling glass and steel building in Chicago. Tanya and Chris were flown in and greeted warmly by Robert, who had coordinated their travel and stay. The room was filled with a diverse group of attendees, executives in tailored suits, community leaders, and a handful of passengers who, like Tanya and Chris, had first-hand experiences to share. After a brief introduction, the discussion began. The airline's CEO, a composed woman with an authoritative air, started by addressing the group. "We've brought you here today because we know we've fallen short," she said. "The incident involving Ms. Davis and Mr. Carter was a wake-up call for us. It forced us to look in the mirror and confront uncomfortable truths about our culture, our training, and our approach to customer service." Tanya shifted in her seat, feeling the weight of the moment. She glanced at Chris, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. As the conversation unfolded, Tanya and Chris shared their experience in detail, the humiliation they felt, the fear of speaking up, and the relief when action was finally taken. Other passengers shared similar stories, and community leaders provided insight into how bias, both explicit and implicit, could manifest in professional settings. One advocacy leader, a middle-aged man named Marcus, addressed the room passionately. "It's not just about training," he said. "It's about creating a culture where people feel empowered to speak up when they see something wrong. Whether it's a passenger calling out bad behavior or a colleague holding another colleague accountable." Tanya found herself nodding. "He's right," she said, her voice clear and confident. "When Karen insulted us, it wasn't just about her words. It was about the silence around us. No one stepped in. No one spoke up. That was almost worse." The room fell silent for a moment as her words sank in. Over the next several hours, the discussion ranged from policy changes to personal anecdotes. The airline shared updates on their progress, new hiring practices designed to increase diversity, a hotline for employees to report misconduct anonymously, and plans to expand the sensitivity training to include scenarios based on real passenger feedback. By the end of the day, Tanya felt a mix of emotions: exhaustion from reliving the experience, but also hope. It wasn't just talk, it was action. As they prepared to leave the headquarters the next morning, Tanya and Chris were approached by the CEO. She extended her hand with a warm smile. "I want to thank you both," she said. "Your courage in speaking up has made a real difference. We're not perfect, and we still have a long way to go. But this is a step in the right direction, and it wouldn't have happened without you." Tanya shook her hand, feeling a wave of pride. "Thank you," she said. "I just hope this really makes a difference for everyone." The flight home felt different. Tanya and Chris sat in the same economy seats they always did, but the atmosphere felt lighter, the crew more attentive. Tanya leaned her head against the window, watching the clouds drift by. For the first time since that fateful day, she felt at peace. "Do you think it'll last?" she asked Chris quietly. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we gave them the push they needed. The rest is up to them." Tanya smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Then I guess we did what we could." And with that, she closed her eyes, letting the steady hum of the plane lull her into a sense of calm she hadn't felt in months. The unforeseen legacy. Back home in Atlanta, Tanya and Chris were beginning to move on from the events of their flight, but the impact of their story kept rippling outward in ways they hadn't anticipated. News of the airline's sweeping changes had reached far beyond the aviation industry, sparking discussions in workplaces, schools, and online communities about the importance of standing up to bias and poor treatment. What had started as a moment of discomfort for Tanya and Chris had become a catalyst for a broader conversation. One evening, as Tanya sat grading papers in the living room, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a woman named Maya, a fellow teacher from another state. The subject line read, "Your story inspired me to act." Tanya's curiosity piqued as she opened the email. It read, "Dear Tanya, I hope this message finds you well. I saw your story in the news a few weeks ago, and I can't tell you how much it resonated with me. I work in a school district where subtle biases and inequities are an everyday reality. I've witnessed colleagues and students being dismissed or spoken to unfairly, but I've always stayed quiet, thinking, it's not my place. After hearing about your courage and the changes you inspired, I decided to speak up when I saw one of my students being unfairly disciplined. It wasn't easy, but because of your example, I found the strength to do it. Thank you for showing me that one voice can make a difference. Warm regards, Maya. Tanya's heart swelled as she read the email. She shared it with Chris, who smiled proudly. See, he said, this is bigger than just us. You've inspired people to take a stand. Tanya nodded, a lump forming in her throat. I never thought it would go this far. In the weeks that followed, similar messages trickled in. Some were from people who'd faced similar experiences on flights or in public spaces. Others were from professionals in various industries who were implementing their own initiatives to improve inclusivity and respect in the workplace. It was both heartening and overwhelming to realize that their small act of defiance had sparked so much change. But not everyone was supportive. Tanya and Chris occasionally received messages from people who dismissed their actions as overblown or accused them of seeking attention. One particularly harsh comment on a news article read, "Why ruin someone's career over a single bad day? Everyone makes mistakes." Chris, ever the optimist, brushed it off. "Haters gonna hate," he said with a shrug. But Tanya couldn't let it go as easily. "Maybe they're right," she said one night as they sat on the couch. "What if Karen really was just having a bad day? What if we overreacted?" Chris turned to her, his expression serious. "Tanya, stop. This wasn't about one bad day. It was about a pattern of behavior. Karen humiliated us in front of a plane full of people, and you know we weren't the first. If we hadn't spoken up, who knows how many others would have gone through the same thing." Tanya sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I know. It's just hard to shake that feeling." Several weeks later, the airline reached out again, inviting Tanya and Chris to visit their headquarters once more. This time, it wasn't for a roundtable discussion. The airline wanted to film a short documentary about the changes they'd implemented and how Tanya and Chris's story had been the catalyst. The couple hesitated. "Do we really want to do this again?" Tanya asked. "I feel like we've already done enough." Chris, however, saw it differently. "This isn't just about us anymore," he said. "It's about showing other people that change is possible, and that speaking up matters." Reluctantly, Tanya agreed. A few weeks later, they were back in Chicago, sitting in a brightly lit studio surrounded by cameras and crew members. The filming process was surprisingly intimate. Instead of focusing solely on the airline's response, the producers wanted to delve into Tanya and Chris's lives, who they were, what they valued, and how the experience had changed them. One question from the interviewer caught Tanya off guard. "How do you feel about Karen now?" Tanya paused, her mind racing. She hadn't thought much about Karen since the incident. She knew the woman had been dismissed from her role, but beyond that, Karen had faded into the background of the story. Now she was being asked to confront her feelings about the person at the center of it all. "I don't hate her," Tanya said finally. "I was angry, sure. Hurt, definitely. But hate? No. I think Karen was a product of a system that allowed her behavior to go unchecked. If anything, I hope she's learned from this. I hope she's found a way to grow." Chris nodded in agreement. "This was never about getting her fired," he added. "It was about making sure no one else had to go through what we did." The documentary aired a month later, debuting on the airline's website and social media channels. It quickly went viral, garnering millions of views and sparking widespread discussion. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of speaking up or staying silent, of moments when they felt powerless and moments when they reclaimed their voice. For Tanya and Chris, it was surreal to see their faces on screens across the country. But more than that, it was humbling to realize the impact their story had made. As life continued, Tanya and Chris noticed subtle but meaningful changes in the world around them. They received updates from the airline about ongoing training programs and new policies. Friends and family members began sharing their own experiences of standing up to injustice, citing Tanya and Chris as their inspiration. Even strangers they met in passing recognized them, offering words of encouragement and gratitude. One day, Tanya received an unexpected letter in the mail. The return address was unfamiliar, and the handwriting was neat but unremarkable. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "Dear Tanya, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know my actions hurt you and Chris, and I've spent a lot of time reflecting on that. Losing my job was a wake-up call, but it was also an opportunity to grow. I'm taking steps to be better, not just as a professional, but as a person. Thank you for holding me accountable. Sincerely, Karen." Tanya stared at the letter, her emotions a whirlwind of surprise, relief, and closure. She handed it to Chris, who read it silently before looking at her. "Well," he said, "I guess that's the last piece of the puzzle." Tanya smiled faintly. "Yeah, I think it is." For the first time since that fateful flight, she felt a sense of peace, not because everything was perfect, but because they had made a difference. They had turned pain into purpose, and that, she realized, was the greatest legacy of all. A new flight path. Months turned into a year, and life moved forward for Tanya and Chris. Their story, though no longer dominating headlines, had left a lasting impact. The airline's changes became a model for other companies, sparking a ripple effect that extended far beyond their expectations. For Tanya, it was a strange mix of pride and humility. Knowing their voices had ignited something larger than themselves, yet still feeling like they were ordinary people caught in an extraordinary moment. It was a crisp fall morning when Tanya received an invitation to speak at a national conference on workplace culture and inclusivity. Held in Washington, D.C., the event promised a lineup of prominent leaders, activists, and policymakers. Tanya was hesitant at first. Public speaking still wasn't her comfort zone, and the idea of sharing her story with such a distinguished audience felt overwhelming. But Chris was unwavering. "You've done it before," he reminded her. "And every time you speak, people listen. This isn't about being perfect, it's about being honest." After some convincing, Tanya agreed. She spent weeks preparing, jotting down notes and practicing in front of Chris, who offered gentle feedback and plenty of encouragement. By the time the conference arrived, she felt ready, or at least as ready as she could be. The event was held in a grand ballroom, its high ceilings adorned with chandeliers that sparkled under the warm glow of the lights. Tanya and Chris arrived early, mingling with attendees and listening to other speakers share their insights. As her time approached, Tanya's nerves grew. She clutched the note cards in her hand, rehearsing the opening lines over and over in her head. When her name was called, Tanya took a deep breath and walked to the stage. The audience's applause was warm but not overwhelming, and she took comfort in the fact that they were there to listen, not to judge. She began her speech with the story of the flight, recounting the events with clarity and emotion. But this time, her focus wasn't on the insult or the aftermath. It was on what came next. "This isn't just about what happened to me and my husband," Tanya said, her voice steady. "It's about what happens every day, in workplaces, schools, and public spaces. It's about the moments when people feel unseen, unheard, and disrespected. And it's about what we can do to change that." She spoke about the airline's response, the policies they implemented, and the impact those changes had on her and on others. She shared stories from people who had reached out to her, people who had found the courage to stand up because they'd seen her do it first. As she finished, the room erupted into applause. Tanya smiled, her confidence bolstered by the audience's reaction. She returned to her seat next to Chris, who gave her a proud grin. "You killed it," he whispered. After the event, Tanya was approached by several attendees who wanted to thank her for sharing her story. One woman, a middle-aged HR professional named Linda, was particularly emotional. "I work in corporate training," Linda said. And for years, I've felt like we weren't doing enough. Hearing your story has given me ideas on how we can do better. Thank you for that." Tanya was touched. "Thank you for listening," she said. "That's where it starts." As they flew home from the conference, Tanya and Chris reflected on how much their lives had changed in the past year. The flight was uneventful, a quiet, comfortable journey where they were treated with the professionalism and courtesy they'd once taken for granted. Tanya watched the clouds drift by outside the window, her mind a mix of gratitude and hope. "I think this is just the beginning," she said softly. Chris looked at her, curious. "Of what?" "Of finding our voices," she replied. "Not just for us, but for others. If one small moment can spark so much change, imagine what else we could do." Chris smiled, reaching for her hand. "Then let's keep going." Over the next few months, Tanya and Chris dedicated themselves to advocacy and education. They partnered with nonprofit organizations, spoke at schools and community events, and even contributed to a book on workplace culture and bias. Their experiences became a case study in courage, proof that even the smallest act of defiance could lead to meaningful transformation. But it wasn't just about the big moments. Tanya found joy in the smaller victories too, watching a young student stand up to a bully, hearing from a colleague who had reported an unfair policy, or simply knowing that the world was a little kinder because of what they had started. One evening, as Tanya sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, she stumbled upon an article about the airline's continued efforts. The piece highlighted how their new training programs had led to a significant decrease in passenger complaints and an increase in employee satisfaction. It even mentioned Tanya and Chris by name, crediting their story as the catalyst for the changes. Tanya smiled as she read, her heart swelling with pride. She glanced over at Chris, who was reading a book in the armchair across the room. "Hey," she said, catching his attention. "Did you ever think we'd make this kind of impact?" Chris looked up, his eyes warm. "Honestly, no, but I knew we couldn't stay silent, and I knew you'd be amazing." Tanya laughed, shaking her head. "It wasn't just me. It was us. All of it." Chris walked over and sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Well, here's to us, and to everyone else who decides to speak up." Tanya leaned against him, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Together, they had turned a moment of pain into a movement of progress, and they knew this was just the beginning of a new flight path, one filled with purpose, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. As the weeks passed, Tanya and Chris's lives gradually returned to a sense of routine. But even though their day-to-day existence had become quieter, they knew they were part of something far greater than they could have ever imagined. The changes they had inspired were continuing to spread, not just within the airline, but in many other industries as well. Tanya, who had once been a reserve teacher, had become an advocate, one whose words resonated with countless people who had long felt overlooked or undervalued. Her journey, both personal and professional, had shaped her into someone unafraid to stand up for what was right, and it wasn't just about one isolated incident anymore. She was part of a larger movement, a movement that called for better treatment, empathy, and accountability in every facet of society. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when Tanya received a call from an unfamiliar number. At first, she thought it might be a solicitor or an automated message, but then the voice on the other end said something that immediately grabbed her attention. "Ms. Davis, this is Greg, the flight supervisor from your flight last year. I'm calling to update you on something important." Tanya's heart skipped a beat. Greg had been the supervisor who intervened that day, ensuring Karen's actions didn't go unnoticed. She remembered the day he had walked down the aisle to speak with them, his calm professionalism providing a sense of support when things had felt out of control. "Greg, what's going on?" Tanya asked, her curiosity piqued. "I wanted to let you know that Karen, well, let's just say she's had a significant personal shift since that incident," Greg began. She's been going through a lot of counseling and retraining to understand the biases that influenced her actions. I don't know if you'll ever hear from her, but I wanted to tell you that she's been taking responsibility." Tanya felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. "Really? I didn't expect that." "I know it might seem surprising," Greg said, "but she reached out to me and said she regretted her actions. She said you were right. She was wrong. She's working to become a better person, and she's committed to change. I just thought you should know." Tanya sat back, processing Greg's words. "Thank you for telling me. It's not easy to hear something like that, but I think it's a good thing." After the call ended, Tanya shared the news with Chris. "Can you believe it?" she said. "Karen is taking responsibility. I didn't expect that." Chris smiled softly. "You know what they say, people can change, and maybe this is the start of that for her." Life in the months following the flight remained steady for Tanya and Chris. They continued speaking at events and contributing to the larger conversation about inclusivity and respect. Their message had been heard by thousands, and their reach continued to grow. Tanya's voice had become a beacon of courage for those who didn't know how to speak up, and her story had become a touchstone for discussions about empathy in the workplace and beyond. One afternoon, Tanya received another email from the airline. This time, it was a formal letter from the CEO. In it, she was invited to participate in a new initiative the airline was launching to promote diversity and inclusion across the industry. The program would involve not just training and workshops, but a new panel of customer advocates who would help shape future policies and provide ongoing feedback. Tanya was being offered a seat at the table. The invitation felt surreal. She had never imagined her story would lead to such a significant opportunity. She glanced over at Chris, who was working on his laptop. "Guess what?" Tanya said, holding up the email. Chris read it, and then looked up with a grin. "You've officially become an industry leader." Tanya laughed, shaking her head. "I'm just a regular person who stood up when I had to. But I guess it's nice that it's led to something bigger." The couple accepted the invitation, and Tanya's role on the panel allowed her to work alongside industry professionals, community leaders, and other advocates. They met regularly to brainstorm new ways to integrate inclusivity and fairness into every level of the travel experience. Tanya's work was no longer just about the incident on the plane. It had grown into a mission to make all industries more aware of how subtle biases could affect people, often without them even realizing it. A year later, Tanya was sitting at the same dining table, this time working on a book she'd been drafting. An extension of the message she'd been spreading. It was a memoir of sorts, but it wasn't just about her experience with Karen or the airline. It was about the power of speaking up, of taking control in situations where injustice reigned, and how one small, seemingly insignificant moment could snowball into a global movement for change. She poured her heart into it, sharing not only her personal story, but the stories of the people she'd met along the way. The coworkers, passengers, and everyday heroes who had been inspired by her actions. She was finally ready to share her journey with the world. One quiet evening, as Tanya and Chris sat on their balcony looking out at the city skyline, Tanya thought back to that day on the plane. The confusion, the anger, the humiliation. At the time, she had no idea that one moment would change her life and so many others. But looking back now, she knew that without that day, nothing else would have happened. It had been the catalyst, the spark that lit the fire. Chris squeezed her hand gently. "How do you feel about everything now?" he asked softly. Tanya smiled, her heart full of peace. "I feel like we did something that mattered, not just for us, but for everyone who's ever felt disrespected or overlooked. We turned a painful moment into a chance for growth, for change." Chris nodded. "And we're not done yet." And just like that, Tanya realized it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The world was full of untold stories, hidden injustices, and unspoken struggles. As long as people like her and Chris continued to speak up, continue to hold the powerful accountable, there would always be room for change. With each new chapter, each new conversation, each new opportunity, the journey would continue. The flight path had shifted, but it wasn't just about one turbulent trip. It was about the entire journey ahead. A journey of hope, empathy, and the unshakable belief that every voice, no matter how small, had the power to transform the world. And with that, Tanya closed her laptop and leaned into Chris's embrace. Together, they were ready for whatever came next, knowing they had already made a difference that would last long after they were gone.